But the people in power, the censors, they never really understood. Because they saw the dreadlocks, they heard the reggae music, they heard the voice of someone like Peter Tosh, and so it was, oh, okay, no problem, play it, right? But I also think that reggae music, roots reggae music, one of the reasons it was, he could use it to speak to South Africa was because one of the beautiful things about reggae music, and also the terrible things about roots reggae music, is that its metaphors and images and ideas are kind of vague. Right? It's universal, but you know, as I said last night to some friends, with reggae, Babylon could mean anything. Right? Babylon can be racism, Babylon can be capitalism, but Babylon can be your mother. Babylon can be your parents who won't let you out past midnight. So people use reggae music, you know, Babylon's oppression, exploitation, to mean anything. That's a problem because it kind of gets away from some of the real issues, but it's also powerful because that's why reggae can be used globally to talk about any system of oppression, right? Whether it's dense and serious and dread or just, you know, casual and small, right? So it's due to these factors that Lucky Dube was able to get that music out on a regular basis. It was vague enough to include South Africa, but too vague for people to think it was about South Africa, right? Now, I want to say some things about Nigerian reggae, because at the same time that Lucky Dube was coming into power as a reggae musician, Nigeria had established itself as the stronghold of roots reggae on the African continent. I'll give you some names. There's a guy, African China, also known as China Guru, Ras Kimono, Victor Essien, Daddy Shoki, Magic Fashek, just to name a few. Now in Nigeria, roots reggae, it wasn't apartheid. It certainly wasn't Jamaica. But roots reggae, it didn't need to be used. It didn't need to function in a context that was about racism, black and white. You understand that black and white racism in reggae music perfectly fit South Africa. But what would Nigerians do with this, right? Well, I'll tell you what happened. In Nigeria, reggae becomes really popular. Roots reggae becomes popular during the 80s and the 90s through the period, the long period of Nigerian dictators, right? So that was the period, the golden age of reggae in Nigeria, from Ibrahim Babangida all the way to Sani Abacha, the two worst of the dictators, right? Particularly Abacha, who was a serious enemy of the free press. And he ruthlessly arrested people, murdered people, assassinated people, and he also did something that dictators need to do. All dictators do this. They make it seem as if there is no other country on the planet. That's what dictators do. They create a culture that is focused on itself and can't think globally, right? And so they allowed reggae music to play in Nigeria because it didn't seem like it was about Nigeria, but they were closing down how people thought about the world. They wouldn't even allow Western musicians to tour, right? So in Nigeria, because of the dictators, you were disconnected from the rest of Africa. You were disconnected from the world. All you knew was the dictator, the armed guards, the police state. That's all you knew. But they allowed reggae, right? Roots reggae specifically, not dancehall, right? Because for them now in Nigeria, they were able to play this music, but they weren't being beaten. They were not being treated like Fela. Who knows Fela? Fela Kuti? Please, please. Fela. Okay, thank you. You know that Fela was beaten probably every day. Right? Right. He was very confrontational, but the Nigerian artists were not being beaten and jailed and executed like Fela and people who spoke out. And I think it's because Fela didn't use metaphors. Right? Fela was very literal, right? And when he did use metaphors, everybody knew what he was talking about. When the Rasta musicians were talking about Babylon, Zion, free the people, the dictators didn't even worry about it, right? It didn't feel threatening to them at all, right? So I think that's why they never got treated the way Fela was treated in Nigeria, because reggae allowed you to speak about something so vague that no one understood exactly what you were talking about, but vague enough so that your own people understand exactly what you're talking about, right? And that's the beautiful thing about roots reggae. So roots reggae in Nigeria during the dictatorships, it produced in a lot of the people who loved the music, and a lot of them did during this period, it didn't provide them a sense of Africa in a global way. It gave them the sense of being colonized from inside, right? For them, they were in Babylon, but technically, for the Rastafarians in Jamaica, they were in Zion, right? So for the Nigerians listening to reggae, Africa was Babylon, not Zion. Right? And that's really important to understand. But another important thing is for the Nigerians, don't forget, reggae comes to power during the dictatorships, but also it's a nation that still was recovering from genocide. You know about the Biafran War? The Biafran War in the late 60s, the genocide of the Igbos, right? The reggae music came at a time where people were still thinking about genocide, and so it was very important for, and I think this is a country where this kind of, what I'm about to say, I think probably resonates in a powerful way, for the people in Nigeria. Reggae allowed them to deal with a genocide without talking about their own ethnicity. You understand? Reggae allowed them to not talk about being Hausa or Igbo, right? Because Hausas massacred the Igbos. That was the genocide. So they didn't want to talk about race and ethnicity in their own country because it was enough to cause more trouble. You must understand this point. Yeah. So what reggae did was allow them to talk about race, colonialism, oppression, genocide, but in a way that included everybody that was there, right? Because they were all now black. They weren't black before, but they became black when they started listening to the music, right? And I think that was great. That was a powerful thing about reggae. As I said, at this time period, very few external musicians from outside of Africa came through Nigeria, right? But for the Nigerians, reggae music allowed them to really think about themselves without talking about themselves, right? Now, roots reggae and dancehall are still very popular in Nigeria, right? But I think dancehall was a problem for them because dancehall didn't talk about race or racism at the time. Dancehall didn't talk about black man, white man, colonialism, racism. It didn't talk about that. So they weren't interested in the dancehall. So they made their own reggae and talked about Babylon, Zion, colonialism, etc. Because dancehall didn't talk about these issues. But most importantly, at the time, dancehall didn't mention Africa at all. And so for Africans, what was the point? There's no Africa in dancehall. So they made their own music that talked about Africa, and the Africa they were talking about was not the Africa they lived in. But what's important about this for me is that the Africa they were talking about now because of reggae was an Africa that was possible. It's an Africa that they could make. So roots reggae, and one of the great ironies for me, roots reggae may be from Jamaica about its African past and a vision of the past. For Africans, reggae is a vision of the future, right? Something that could happen that we can actually create, right? So one thing that happened is reggae starts to decline in Nigeria for two reasons. I think the death of Nelson Mandela in 1990 and the death of the last worst dictator, Sani Abacha, in 1997. And it's in that period that hip-hop and R&B enter into Nigerian music, right? And Nigerian culture. I made a mistake. I'm a little jet lagged. I said the death of Nelson Mandela. I didn't mean that.
As a symbol.
What I meant was the release of Nelson Mandela and the death of Sani Abacha.